One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett and welcome to the summer series of Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. Over the summer, we're revisiting some of the biggest and best stories from our live events and webinars from this year. In today's episode, we are digging into one of the biggest policy problems facing Australia, the housing mess and how we can fix it, with Australia's favourite finance journalist, the ABC's Alan Kohler. This was recorded on Tuesday, November the 28th, 2023, and things may have changed since recording. So one of the great mysteries of Australian life is that a land of sweeping plains and with one of the lowest population densities on the planet has a shortage of land for houses. As a result, Sydney's median house price is the second most expensive on earth after Hong Kong. And this escalation in house prices is a pain that has altered Australian society, as this essay talks about today. We've now got a big gap between those who have a house and those who don't. And this essay tracks how things went seriously wrong at the start of the 21st century when there was a huge and permanent rise in the price of housing. So today we're going to dig into what actually happened and what to do now. And I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Alan Kohler, author of this quarterly essay. He's the finance presenter on ABC and a columnist for The New Daily, a former editor of The Age and the Australian Financial Review. He founded the Eureka Report and has written for The Australian, The AFR, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And his books include It's Your Money. G'day, Alan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
G'day, Ebony. Great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to solving Australia's housing crisis in the next hour with you. I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it.
I wish we could.
I did want to start out at the very beginning of the essay, and you kind of set out three generations of housing that helps kind of tell that story of what has gone wrong or what has happened to housing prices in the past few decades. Can you start with us there at the beginning? What has happened to housing in Australia?
Well, I talked about my parents who bought a block of land in South Oakley, which is 8 miles from the CBD, and they built a house, got a wall service loan. Now, I don't know what my dad was a carpenter. I don't know what he was paid, but I do know that the sort of rough price of a house and land package in those days was £1,250, and the median, so the average wage was about £350 a year. So the on average houses cost about 3.5 times incomes when my parents bought a house, and I sort of looked at what my wife and I did when we bought our first house in 1980, and it was about the same, 3.5 times. And in fact, it wasn't just for us. I mean, I was on the average wage at the time as a young journalist, and I think we actually did pay about the median house price for our first house. But so the median house price in 1980 was 3.5 times incomes, and that prevailed right up until about 2000. And then what you can see from the charts is that after 2000, house prices started rising more quickly than wages and more quickly than GDP, really for the first time since Federation, really. I mean, it was the first time. And house prices from the year 2000 began to rise, but at 6% compound per annum on average. Obviously, there were ups and downs on average, whereas wages and GDP continued to increase at about 2 or 3% per annum. So when my kids went to buy a house in the last few years, they had to pay 7 to 8 times their incomes, and the median house price in Australia is about 7 to 8 times, 7.5 times the average wage. And so the multiple of house prices to wages has doubled over the past 23 years since the year 2000. And so the question that I had to answer, and it's in some ways the first question anyone has to answer in relation to housing affordability is what happened in 2000. What was the thing that made that happen?
And so you've identified a couple of key things there. Can you just take us through that? Because there's a wonderful graph. I'll see if I can find it in here, but it's extremely stark, isn't it? The change is after that. So what happened?
Well, the thing that happened in September 1999 was that the capital gains tax was halved. The Howard government changed the way that capital gains tax is calculated from being where you add the capital gain to your income for tax purposes minus the effect of inflation, which was the deal since 1985.
Yep.
And in September 1999, they changed that to be that you added only half of the capital gain to your income. Now, the 50% discount that they introduced at that time wasn't that much more than the impact of inflation, the inflation adjustment, because inflation in those days was fairly high. And given the average holding time for an asset, in a residential property, so 50% was roundabout a bit more, but not that far above the deduction that people were actually doing using CPI. But the point is that nobody really understands inflation and CPI, and but everyone understands 50% discount. 50% off. It's great. So that was a huge psychological change in the way that people thought about capital gains and the way that they were taxed. And the thing that really made it work and supercharged demand for housing was negative gearing. Now, we've had negative gearing forever, which is where you get to deduct any losses from your investment property against your salary or other incomes, rather than confining the losses to the income from that particular investment. But up until the year 2000, there weren't many people using negative gearing. It wasn't a very popular thing, partly because everyone, the tax dodgers were using other tax dodgers than that. But what happened was that once everyone could see, when I sell the asset, I only have to pay capital gains tax on half the gain, negative gearing became really popular. And so you can see from the tax office data, there was a huge increase in the number of people taking advantage of negative gearing after the year 2000 because of the capital gains tax discount. And also the other thing which happened a bit earlier was the abolition of inheritance taxes in 1978. Now, we'd had inheritance taxes since 1914. It was introduced to pay for the First World War. And Malcolm Fraser and Joh Bjelke-Petersen abolished them in the mid to late 70s, so that not only if you sold the asset, you only paid tax on half the gain. If you didn't sell the asset and pass it on to your children, there was no tax at all. And so the whole thing became, investment property became a massive tax dodge, and everyone got into it.
Yeah. And so, as you mentioned, it was really the linking of the CGT discount and negative gearing that kind of caused that explosion, because prior to that, some people were using negative gearing, but often not, for housing purposes. And you kind of talk about the fact that a lot of people weren't making, there was as many people who had positively gained kind of investments as there was negatively, and it just kind of flipped that all around.
Absolutely. So, it became, and look, graphs don't lie. There it is. You can see it in the graph, in the essay, what happened, and it happened from the year 2000. That's the amount of negatively geared property.
That's right. That's rental losses and
rental losses
in production of capital gains. Huge change in the figures. So that's kind of what happened. I just wanted to talk about who are the people who are mostly impacted by this change. You kind of talked about your children. Is that the case across the board? This is mostly impacting younger generations?
Well, sure. I mean, it's always the case that older people are richer than younger people because they've been working for longer, and they've been, when houses were increasing at sort of in value by 3% a year, then if you had a house for 40 years, obviously you got more wealth than your kids. So, that's always been true. However, because of that big change from 1980, people who were born after not from 1980, from 2000, people who were born from in 1980 and became adults in the early 2000s, they were the ones who started to miss out, because that's when house prices started rising. You know, everyone now talks about the inequality between baby boomers and millennials, which is true. But it's only because of this aberration, this 23-year-long aberration in house prices, that's occurred, because all generations have a difference in wealth, but because of the way house prices have behaved over the past 23 years, it's much greater between baby boomers and millennials. And it's not baby boomers' fault. I mean, although I suppose it may be true that most of the negative gearers are baby boomers. I don't know, but that's certainly the result.
Yeah. And so in the essay, you kind of go through some of the issues of supply and demand. There's a couple of things I wanted to pick out there. I want to start with supply and the role of public housing in how we make housing affordable and accessible to people. You dig into a little bit of the history here, and it's been a big political issue this year because of the government's big plan to invest in public housing. So can you just tell us a little bit about the role of public housing in history and its impacts and how it interacted with housing prices?
Well, the government created the Commonwealth Housing Commission in 1938, and they produced a big report in 1944. And then there was a Commonwealth State Housing Agreement led by the Commonwealth Housing Commission. And that was really the beginning of a housing policy in Australia and the beginning of public housing. And so in the late 1940s, there was a lot of public housing, a lot of Commonwealth money went into public housing, and that continued for a while. But after Bob Menzies was elected in 1949 and then through the 50s, he started to, shift away, you'd have to say shift away from public housing, because his view was that people who rented voted Labor. And what he wanted to do was create a nation of little capitalists who voted Liberal. And so he forced the states to sell their public housing, firstly to the people who are renting them, and then secondly to anybody, on favourable terms. And the idea was to create little capitalists who would vote Liberal, and effectively Menzies killed off public housing, although it was a slow death, and it was kind of finally, I suppose, killed off by Malcolm Fraser. So look, public housing has not been a big thing, for the last few decades in Australia, the governments have never really had enough money to do it. The state governments certainly don't, and in the Commonwealth State Housing Agreements, which actually kept going for quite a long time until 2003. The Commonwealth was supporting and funding the provision of public housing by the states, but it just got smaller and smaller over time. And the other thing Menzies did was he moved the housing portfolio into social services. And so, under Chifley during the war with the Commonwealth Housing Commission, the proposition was that housing was a right of every citizen. And the whole policy was designed to ensure that that everyone in Australia had access to a decent house, that it was, as I say, it was a right. It became, in the 50s, it became welfare. Housing, in terms of the government's focus on it, where it sat within the government, it sat within welfare and has done ever since. So the National Housing Plan that Julie Collins, the Housing Minister, is currently doing is actually being conducted by the Department of Social Services now. So really, ever since the 50s, housing has sat within welfare, or the Social Services Department, and has been seen as welfare. So it's all about social housing, making sure that sort of poor people have a place to live, which is great. I'm not saying that's terrible. It's just that that doesn't address the affordability problem that we're talking about, the fact that the median house price has gone from 3.5 times the average wage to 7 to 8 times the average wage. That's a kind of a separate issue to social and affordable housing.
Yeah, and the fact that people on low and middle incomes are increasingly struggling. And as you say, kind of the political impact of pulling it into the Department of Social Services and seeing it through that prism of welfare really does take it into a much different space, and people think about it differently, as
Exactly.
a handout rather than,
That's right.
human right. Yeah.
So the person or the family on the average wage now cannot afford to buy the average house. But those people on the average wage aren't on welfare; they're on the average wage.
Yeah.
But they can't afford to buy the average house, which I think is a big problem.
Yeah. Before we move on from public housing, I was interested in the two Marys and their involvement in public housing back in the day. There's a little bit of history I wasn't aware of. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Well, the Commonwealth Housing Commission in 1944 was led by a bloke named Leo O'Connor, who was a batsman for Queensland. And on the commission with him was a woman named Mary Wilmot Phillips, whose husband, John Phillips, later became the governor of the Reserve Bank, but that's another story. And the secretary of the commission was Mary Ryan. And in their report that they put out in 1944, which described housing as a right of every citizen, they actually described the house and, how many rooms, how high the ceilings were, and in detail what the kitchen was like, and how easy it was for the woman in the kitchen to, use the utensils and the appliances, and how far everything was from each other and so on. I mean, and those things were written by the two Marys. And in particular, Mary Ryan was, as the secretary, she kind of took down the notes and wrote the report. And it's a wonderful thing. I mean, you can Google it, the Commonwealth Housing Commission report of 1944. It's really worth reading. It's great.
Yeah. A couple of other things you touch on or explore in the essay when it comes to supply is also sprawl and zoning. I wanted to talk about sprawl first and how that impacts things. You talk about the fact that, a lot of other cities are older than Australia and were designed well before the car. How has sprawl impacted the way housing and cities are designed in Australia that compares to how other countries have done it?
I should say here that I'm a professional oversimplifier, Ebony. So, that's what I'm doing. But look, with that caveat, Australian cities were largely developed after cars became affordable. It wasn't before. It wasn't when cars were invented, but up until around about 1950, till the Second World War, cars were expensive and not many people had them. But after 1950, cars became cheaper. Everyone had one. And that's when the cities were developed. So in Europe, in particular, and also to some extent in America, the cities were developed well before cars became affordable, and so housing was denser and had to be built, as for walking distance and horse riding distance and so on. So that resulted in particular European cities being really dense. But Australia, because everyone had a car, they were okay to, as my parents did, build a house, 8 miles from the city, which had a nice big block and a single place on it. And so from then on, really, our cities sprawled with, large blocks with single houses on them as far as the eye can see. And, that's kind of really defined the character, the nature of the physical geography of our cities, which makes it now very difficult to densify them because, everyone owns a single block. Developers can't, it's very difficult for developers to put all blocks together to create dense housing. And so, what we've ended up is reverse donuts, so that in the center of the city and very inner suburbs, there's high rise. So there's kind of lots of dense housing in the middle, but then there's nothing for, as far as the eye can see, apart from single dwellings. And a lot of the discussion about housing supply comes at the moment is all about, we need to make the suburbs more dense, which is correct. We need to do that if we can, but it's very difficult. And it's not just about zoning, although that's a part of it. It's also about planning, councils, making planning decisions, but also just the ability of developers to put together proper blocks that can that they can build decent housing on.
I want to come back to, I guess, government's role in causing some of these issues. We've already touched on some of those taxation arrangements like the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, but I want to come now to the first home buyers grant, because we often hear politicians talk about making housing more affordable, but as some of my economist colleagues at the Australia Institute say, they never really say that they want housing prices to go down. No politician really ever says that. That's kind of the political issue that they're dealing with. But oftentimes these policies are really making the problem worse. So can you tell us a little bit about the role of first home buyers grants in making the housing mess?
Well, the first home buyers grant was devised in 1966 by Robert Menzies due to lobbying from the New South Wales branch of the Young Liberals, the president of which at the time was John Howard. Anyway, so that was the first one, and there have been a succession of first home buyer grants ever since. And the latest one is, the latest thing is in Queensland, where the Premier has doubled the first home buyer grant from 15,000 to 30,000. And the trouble with first home buyer grants is they don't do anything about housing affordability. They just help some people buy a house, and the money simply goes on to the price. They simply are able to bid more than they would otherwise bid, and they do. But the thing is, they don't just bid by the amount of the grant, whatever it might be. So, for example, $30,000 in Queensland, it's not $30,000 that goes on the price. That's the basis on which you can borrow more. So it's actually $150,000 that goes on the price, because $30,000 enables you to borrow more. So yeah, look, I mean, it's just a band-aid. It's kind of a political fix. It doesn't do anything. Well, in fact, it worsens housing affordability. But as you say, I mean, politicians don't want to actually deal with housing affordability. And we can perhaps get to that. I mean, the housing affordability is not a problem, not an issue that politicians want to address, really.
Yeah,
they want to.
Let's get into those reasons. Like, why is that? Why is it so difficult for politicians to do the right thing here?
Well, because most people own a house. Two-thirds of their voters own a house, and the owners of houses quite like the fact that they're going up in value. It's nice. You're making more money, and actually, even the people who don't own a house, who are renting, want to get on what they call the property ladder. But for that to work, it has to be a ladder, right? I mean, everyone wants house prices to rise, even those who don't own one. They just want the house. They want the price of the house they buy to come down a bit so that they can buy it, and then they want it to go up in value and keep rising. So it's like there isn't really any constituency in the country that wants the problem to be dealt with, actually. And powerful people, such as politicians themselves and banks all want house prices to keep rising because they lend. That means they lend more money and they make more profits, and the executives get paid more. And property developers all want house prices to rise. Economists talk about the wealth effect of housing and the fact that Australia's per capita wealth is increasing, and how good that is for consumption and good for the economy. I mean, it's very difficult to apart from the few renters, it's very difficult to find a constituency in Australia that actually wants house prices to stop rising. And if you think about it, I mean, the problem, as I keep saying, is that the house price to income ratio has doubled in 23 years. It's a shock. It's an aberration that's occurred, right? So to deal with that, you would either have to halve house prices so that they went back to 3.5 times incomes, or you would have to stop house prices rising to allow incomes to catch up. There's no other real solution. Halving house prices is neither possible nor a good idea. So forget that. So the only way to deal with housing affordability and to return the relationship of house prices to incomes back to what it was is to stop house prices rising for a while. And with incomes rising at 4% a year as they are now, that would take 18 years. But who wants house prices to not rise for 18 years or just stay put? Nobody. I mean, in the last few years, they've been all over the place. In 2021, house prices went up by 21%. 2022, they went down by 9% because interest rates went up. This year, they've recovered all of that decline of 9% back to 9%. So, 21 up, 9 down, 9 up. So it's volatile, but really we're talking long term. What will house prices do over 20 years? And the last 20 years has been an average of 6% per annum compound. Wages have been increasing by not much, 2 to 3% over that period. So there's a big difference in the compound annual growth rate of house prices and wages. Now the wages going up by 4%. So in order to address the balance, house prices would need to rise by less than 4% per annum. Now, the closer the increase in house prices on average is over the next 20 years, the longer it would take, right? So if house prices rise by 1% less than wages, then it'll take 50 years for the balance to be addressed. And if house prices didn't rise at all, it would take 18 years. Obviously, if house prices went down consistently, then it would take less time.
But then we'd be talking about something like a global financial crisis, like a big economic downturn, right? That's why you were saying it's not ideal. Obviously, if you own a home, you don't want that, but that's economically what you'd kind of be talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so the GFC, which we all remember in 2008, that was caused by American house prices falling by 30% between 2006 and 7. So a 30% fall in American house prices caused a global financial crisis and recession. And obviously if something like that happened in Australia, it would have a similar effect because lots of people would go broke, because they've borrowed on the basis of a particular value of housing, whether it's banks and lenders and the owners of housing. So, yeah, I mean, that's the absolute last thing you want.
Exactly. So yeah, you've very neatly outlined, I guess, the very real problems that politicians who might try and address this would be facing electorally. Just sticking with the United States for 1 second, I was really interested in, you kind of mentioned the role of 30-year fixed mortgages there, and that's something that Australians don't have access to. Can you talk a little bit about why that's something that Americans have access to and that we don't, and the role that having access to those kinds of loans has in the United States and their access to affordable housing?
Yeah, sure. So look, and this doesn't really change the house price equation. It simply obviously means that, if you take out a 30-year loan, fixed rate loan, you know what's going on for the whole of your life, really. You know what you've got. America has 30-year fixed rate mortgages because in 1938, Franklin D. Roosevelt, as a part of the New Deal, created something called the Federal Mortgage Association, which was a government body that was set up to buy mortgages from the banks to provide them with liquidity and security so that they could offer 30-year mortgages. And Roosevelt explicitly did that to achieve 30-year fixed rate mortgages, because otherwise banks couldn't do it. Banks take on deposits at call mostly. And so that's very short-term, in a sense, borrowing by the banks, and, they can't really viably lend it for 30 years. So Fannie Mae, the Federal Mortgage Association, which became known as Fannie Mae, did it. So the thing was that when the Great Depression hit, this is just a sort of a kink of history in a way. When the Great Depression hit, America had a conservative president and Australia had a Labor government when the Depression hit. Naturally, in the Depression, when unemployment goes to 30%, whatever government is in power gets kicked out and the other side gets put in. So in America, they got a progressive government after the Depression, FDR. Australia got a conservative government Joe Lyons. And Joe Lyons was not interested in doing a New Deal like FDR was doing because he was a conservative. And so when in 1938 FDR did the Fannie Mae thing, Joe Lyons didn't, and he didn't want to do it. And then he died in office. And eventually John Curtin, I mean, he was replaced by Bob Menzies at the time in the late 30s. And then there was an election which John Curtin won. And then there was a war. And so even though we got a Labor government, there was a war and the moment was lost. Everything was, got sort of lost in that. And then for some reason that I don't fully understand, we've no Labor government since then has thought of creating an Australian version of Fannie Mae that would give us the benefit of 30-year fixed rate mortgages. So our fixed rate mortgages max out at 5 years, and they've still got fixed rates. So during the pandemic, when interest rates were the cash rate was zero in the US and here, and we're all getting 2% mortgages. In America, they were locking in their 2% for 30 years. It's wonderful. I mean, now the 30-year fixed rate mortgage is 8%, right? So it's not something you want to lock in for 30 years, but nevertheless, there are times when it's great.
Yeah. I'm going to go to questions from the audience in just a second, and I can see that we've got just about 1,000 people on with us. Thanks so much for joining us. I did, I guess, just want to, before we go to those questions, touch on the bank of mum and dad. I think we've all read in various newspapers, young people being able to afford, multiple investment properties and those kinds of things, and how they've done it. And sure enough, if you read far enough through, it's because they've got a big loan from the bank of mum and dad. That's not accessible to everyone, obviously. But how big is that? How many Australians are relying on that bank of mum and dad in order, as you said, to get on that property ladder in the first place? Exactly how big is it? How important is it?
I think I said in the yesterday. I just can't remember now. I think we said it's the third biggest lender in the country or something like that.
I think ninth, actually.
Oh, ninth. There you are. Well, it's a big lender. But the thing is, and the thing to bear in mind is that's only the loans, right? Most of the bank of mum and dad stuff is gifts, where mum and dad just give the kids the deposit. And so it's kind of an early inheritance. I mean, the issue is what we were talking about before is that because of this, what's happened in the last 23 years, it's baby boomers and millennials that have kind of been the winners and losers here. And the other problem is that we're all living longer. I mean, in the old days, we used to retire at 65 and die at 70. But now we're all living to 90. And that means that, by the time mum and dad die, the kids are in their 60s. It's way too late. It used to be able to get an inheritance a bit earlier than that. But now mum and dad have to cough up before, well before they die, because otherwise the kids can't afford a house.
Yeah.
Which obviously to some extent robs their own retirement funds. But but as you say, not everybody's got that situation. I mean, not everybody's parents have got money, and so in a way, it's simply another way that, in fact, possibly the main way that inequality is being entrenched by this increase in house prices, because wealth begets wealth or enables further wealth, because that enables people to get into housing, which then builds their own wealth, whereas others who haven't got the parents who have got money have to keep renting and they don't build their wealth.
Yeah. I'm going to go now to some questions from the audience. I've got one here from Josie Gibson, and she says, if you had Treasurer Jim Chalmers sitting in front of you right now, what are the top 3 things that you would advise the government to do to tackle housing affordability?
I would say that really the number one thing you have to do is to adopt Bill Shorten's policies from 2016. Which was to cut the capital gains discount from 50 to 25% and to confine negative gearing to new houses only. With that policy in 2016, Bill Shorten achieved a swing to the Labor Party of 3.1% and picked up 14 seats. Didn't win, but it was really encouraging. And he thought he got cocky and he thought he was going to win in 2019. So he had those policies, and he added a crackdown on dividend franking to the policies, and he lost badly in 2019, did worse. And so, and the problem is that the Labor Party and Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese don't actually know why they lost in 2019. Was it capital gains tax and negative gearing, or was it dividend franking? And so, just in case, they dropped everything. Whereas I think that the problem was dividend franking, and if they'd gone to the 2019 election with only the capital gains tax and negative gearing policies, they would have won. And Bill Shorten would be Prime Minister, and Anthony Albanese would be Minister for NDIS.
Yeah. A bit of a sliding doors moment there. The next question I've got is from Steve Gartner, and he asked about the role of superannuation funds in housing. He asked about the role of kind of institutional investors in housing, but in particular superannuation. Can you comment a little bit on what role they have?
Other countries have what's called build to rent, where institutions like super funds develop and own housing developments, in particular sort of apartment blocks, and they own them for a long time and then just rent them out. And so that's their long-term investment. But that we don't have that in Australia, and the reason for that is because super funds don't get the negative gearing and capital gains tax benefits that individuals do. So that all of our apartments and everything are owned by individuals taking advantage of negative gearing. Developers sell the apartments individually. Developers borrow the money from wherever, and then build an apartment block, and then they sell the apartments to individuals who then rent them out in negative gear. And super funds can't get into that game. And the other problem is that super funds see property in general as a income yield play. So they invest in shopping centres and offices and so on for the purposes of getting income, rental income. The capital gains from those things is not that great. It's all about income. So the mindset of super funds when investing in property is that it's about income, but residential property yields are much lower than commercial property yields, like 2% or something. They're going up a bit at the moment, but not that much. And so super funds don't see property as a capital gain investment. And part of the reason is that they don't get the benefit of the capital gains tax discount. Well, they get less benefit. They've got lower tax rates. And so, one of the things that Julie Collins, the housing minister, is trying to do is to find a way to encourage build to rent in Australia, which I encourage. I think it's great. And she's coming up with sort of tax incentives to encourage super funds to do it. And I think that needs to happen. But the thing is that those tax incentives kind of, in a sense, only offset the impact of negative gearing that makes it not worthwhile for them.
Yeah. The next question that I've got is from Alistair McCulloch, who says, it strikes me that the key change was the shift in seeing housing as homes or places to live to being investments which could be borrowed against. And key to reform is the changing of that perception. And he asks if you've got any ideas on how to change that perception, given the political costs that we've just been talking about.
I do. I think it's taken a long time for that perception to be embedded in Australia, that housing is a speculative asset as opposed to just a place to live. And I think the only way to remove that idea, that mindset, is for house prices not to be a speculative asset or a good speculative asset for a long time, like 20 years. So I think the only way to fix that sort of mindset is to find a way to ensure that house prices don't go up for 20 years. And I mean, I'm not saying that's easy, and I don't think it would be popular, but I think the questioner is absolutely right. That's part of the problem is, it's worth just reminding ourselves that when it's fighting inflation, the Reserve Bank always talks about inflation expectations. What it's trying to do is dampen inflation expectations by putting up interest rates. And so it's inflation expectations that result in inflation, because if everyone expects prices to go up, they will. And it's the same with house prices. We have a house price inflation expectations, and everyone expects house prices to go up. And so they do. But to get rid of that takes a lot of effort and time.
The next question is from Ken Blackman, who says, given Australians live in the biggest homes in the world on average, is there a potential in downsizing the number of squares in our dwellings? He mentions that voluntarily is probably unlikely, and also talks about the impacts of climate change and, you know, other things, adaptation to climate change that we'll have to be thinking about. Is there a role, I guess you touched a little bit already on planning elements, but yeah, can you talk maybe about downsizing and the role of planning potentially in how we might start fixing this mess?
I don't think any government is going to force everyone to have smaller houses. You know, I mean, you said voluntarily is probably not going to happen. I think that's true, unless it's forced. But the government, no government's going to say, okay, everybody, you can only have 3 bedrooms now. Sorry, 1 bathroom, not 2. No, that's not going to happen.
You do talk a little bit though about some community pushback around zoning and planning and things like that, and that not the NIMBYs creating the donut, but also this new phenomenon of the YIMBYs, people who are looking for better planning and zoning arrangements. Do you want to tell people a little bit about the YIMBYs?
Yeah, the YIMBY movement started in San Francisco 10 years ago and spread to Australia. The first group of YIMBYs in Australia were in Canberra, where they have a particular zoning problem where I think, I can't remember the exact number, but it's for a certain number of kilometres from the centre of the city, you actually can only have 1 dwelling per block. So it's prohibited to have more than 1 dwelling. So anyway, they started trying to do something about that. And now there's a YIMBY group in Melbourne and another one in Sydney. And what they're doing is going along to council meetings and arguing in favour of developments, because they say that, which is true, that the only people who go to council meetings to talk about developments are those who are against them, because nobody else can be bothered. And so they go along and they talk in favour of developments, which is kind of beginning to change the dynamic a little. And good on them, I reckon. They're also, you know, producing some reports and, you know, doing some media and arguing in favour of more medium density dwellings and housing in the country. And obviously, yes, YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. So they're kind of trying to achieve more high medium density housing in the suburbs to replace the kind of single dwelling per block idea. And I've been talking to them, and they're great. They're all millennials and young people, as you'd expect.
Yep. The ones missing out. The next question I've got is from Darren Gould, who says the use of land tax and phasing out of stamp duty has been recommended by many tax reviews, and I think is in use in some degree in the ACT. That's correct. We're in the middle of a big changeover here, moving towards land tax and away from stamp duty. Alan, is that a way to help solve the issue, asks Darren?
Well, it would solve that issue. I mean, stamp duty is an additional burden on top of the shift or the increase in house prices that's occurred. So not only are houses much more expensive than they used to be in relation to incomes, you've got the stamp duty on top of it. And so stamp duty would certainly help, or removing it would certainly help, and replacing it with land tax, which is in a sense almost an amortization of land tax, because, you know, the stamp duty. So, you know, you're in a sense amortizing the stamp duty over the life of the asset.
I'm just going to say, for those people who don't know what amortization means, what are you talking about there?
Oh, it's just spreading the thing. You know, amortization means spreading the cost over a long period of time. So, you know, say the stamp duty is 100,000. You know, they'll kind of say, well, the land tax is 10,000 a year, which is basically the stamp duty over 10 years. Anyway, so. The trouble with that is that state governments depend on stamp duty revenue, right? And so they need the Commonwealth to fix them up in the early years, because if the government went from stamp duty to land tax, suddenly their revenue would collapse, to begin with, and they'd just be, it'd all last longer. They'd be, it'd be nice for a long period of time, but, they just can't afford it. So the Commonwealth has said, we're not going to do that. We can't afford it either.
The next question I've got is from Rachel Hay, who says, housing is very much currently on the front of my mind. I had to move rentals only a few months ago and my new house is now for sale. I'd love to be able to buy a house at some point to have more stability in my living situation, but as a young person, it's impossible at the moment and looks uncertain in the future. Love to see wages increase and house prices stabilise, but in the meantime, are better tenants' rights and addressing rental prices as important in making housing affordable?
I think so. I absolutely think so. And I think the way we sit at the moment is a lot of people are simply going to be unable to buy a house. And so they have to rent, and possibly for their whole life, certainly for a long time. So I think that the governments do need to focus on the balance of power between landlords and tenants, and to make it more viable for people to rent long term. One of the things I talk about in the essay is the fact that pets aren't allowed in a lot of rental properties. There is a button you can tick on the REA website called Pets Permitted, but if you tick that, the number of rental properties that are available falls dramatically, and a lot of people want pets. I think one of the things you need to do, and even in Victoria, where they've actually passed some legislation to improve tenants' rights, landlords can still refuse pets, with a decent reason. They just have to have a good reason, and they can still refuse them. So it's I think there are a lot of ways in which that needs to be looked at.
The next question I've got is from Kieran Simpson, who says, can you talk about the impact of population growth and a high migration on housing affordability? You do go into that a little bit in the essay, and you've got some suggestions too on how to change some immigration policy settings. Could you walk us through that?
Well, so as I was saying, that the house prices started rising in 2000 because of the capital gains tax, but in 2005, immigration doubled from around about 100,000 a year to 200,000 a year, and it's stayed high ever since. In the last 12 months, we've had a huge surge of immigration of 500,000, which more than catches up the deficit that occurred during the pandemic. The problem is that that immigration is organised and set by the federal government, housing is run by the state governments, and there's no coordination between the two. The amount of immigration is simply done according to the needs of business and the staffing requirements, and other reasons to do with what the Commonwealth is trying to achieve. And also, don't forget, the Commonwealth gets the benefit of the economic benefit, or kudos, of increased immigration, which boosts consumption, boosts the economy, makes sure that GDP is rising. I mean, for the last few years, GDP's kept rising, the economy kept growing, and we haven't had a recession. However, we've had several per capita recessions. So if you divide GDP by the number of people, it actually has been a recession this year, which, would rebound if the headline said we're in a recession. The federal government would not benefit from that. That'd be bad. The problem is there is no consideration given in setting the amount of immigrants we have to the amount of construction capacity of the industry in Australia to build houses. The average number of people per house is 2.48. It just seems to me logical to say that we can only have number of immigrants can only be 2.48 times the number of housing approvals. I mean, whatever it might be. And housing approvals are about 2 years before the actual house appears. By the time you have the approval, then you have the commencement, and then you have the completion. It's usually about 18 months to 2 years. So it wouldn't be impossible to say when housing approvals are published by the ABS to say, okay, that means that next year's immigration intake is 2.48 times that. I mean, there's absolutely zero consideration given to that idea.
The next question is from Jenny Chambers-Smith, who says, can you please explain why we seem so obsessed with economic growth while that is clearly incompatible with sustainability? And how do we change how we measure success? So in the same way we talk of house prices recovering as if investors are the only people who matter.
Okay, so you need economic growth so that everyone's got a job, because population tends to grow. Population grows, not just natural increase and immigration. Economic growth is required so everyone gets a job. So, but yes, I think there is too much of an obsession with growth. I agree, but I mean it has a lot to do with the fact that we're a capitalist economy that's effectively run by corporations, and the corporations all want growth because they need and want sales to grow, profits to grow, because the investors, who are super funds, who are us, are demanding the share prices of these companies to increase year after year in order that they can produce an investment return. So look, it's all a bit circular, I guess.
I've got another question that's coming back to build to rent schemes and initiatives of recent years. And the focus there is on people paying market rent or subsidised as affordable housing. How difficult is it going to be for governments using that or other means to kind of close that gap that we've got of the long waiting list for social and public housing in Australia?
Well, it's just a matter of money, I guess. I mean, they've just got to build more social and affordable housing. They've created the Housing Australia Future Fund, which they've put enough money into to build 30,000 houses over 5 years, so 6,000 a year. Is that enough? I don't know. Maybe it is. And is it going to be social and affordable housing? They say it is. I'm not quite sure what that means exactly in terms of whether the house gets sold or rented to people. It's not entirely clear as to how that's going to work. But look, I mean, it's all part of the housing as welfare proposition, and the government simply need to put money in it. It's just simply a matter of money.
I might just ask you to come back to the solutions that we need. And, you've talked about some of the policy solutions that the federal government could enact, but can you just give us, I guess, a summary of where you think housing and this issue of housing politically will play out over the next year? And if you do think governments will either look at tax reforms or maybe, as you said, like additional renters' rights and things like that, given how bad the situation is and the focus on it in the middle of a cost of living crisis, where do you see the issue of housing going in the short term politically?
Well, look, I'm afraid I'm pessimistic about this in the short term, particularly. I don't think governments will address it. I don't think they think that there's anything in it for them. In fact, I think the Housing Minister, Julie Collins, was asked this morning about negative gearing and capital gains tax, and she said something like, well, we've made it clear that we're not going to do anything about that. And they're terrified of doing anything about that because of what happened in 2019. I actually think that the starting point for dealing with housing affordability needs to be capital gains tax and negative gearing, because that's when that happened, that's when house prices started taking off. It's not the only thing. There needs to be much more. In fact, I do think that a proper housing policy would have an explicit aim, that is to reduce the house price to income ratio, either back to what it was or to less than it is now. And I think that the housing policies ought to be framed around the multiple of house prices to wages, and say, this is what it is now, this is what we think it should be, and they should have an aim. Just like the climate change policies have an aim, which is 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. So, I think that, and if you then had an aim, you would then start to focus on what you have to do. And you would also have to get achieve a consensus around whatever that aim is, But I just see no sign of that happening. The politicians just simply want to look like they're doing something about it rather than achieve something meaningful about it. So I think that if if the average increase in house prices falls to 3 to 4%, and so therefore continues to rise at the rate of wages, at the same rate as wages, which means that the current level of unaffordability would remain, then that we'll all just have to get used to it. I mean, and that I think is probably likely. I think that if house prices continue to rise at a faster rate than wages, then the crisis will get worse and worse and worse until, it'll be completely unavoidable in 10 years' time. Whoever's in government then will really have to do something about it. I don't know what. But I can't see any government saying, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to get the house price to wages ratio down from what it is now back to what it was. And, no, I don't think any government's going to do that.
It is a sensible aim, though, and it would at least give us something to kind of aim for, I guess. But I will thoroughly recommend The Great Divide, the latest quarterly essay from Alan Kohler. It's available in all good bookshops and news agencies around Australia at the moment. It's a cracking read. And for anyone who loves Alan's finance report on the news every night, there's some amazing graphs in there for your enjoyment. And congratulations. I hope it's receiving good publicity all around Australia, because I think everyone should read it, Alan. It's really fantastic, an amazing essay, and on such an important issue for so many people across Australia. Thank you so much for your time today.
Not at all, Ebony. It's been great. Thank you.
This has been a summer series episode of Follow the Money. You can find all the Australia Institute's research and upcoming webinars and events at australiainstitute.org.au. And you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. If you want to connect with me, I'm Ebony_Bennett with a N_T. Our producer is Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from the Blue Dot Sessions. Hope you're having a great summer. Thanks for listening.